The year is 1962. The world holds its breath, teetering on the brink of nuclear war. Cuba. Missiles. Russia. America. Every shadow hides a secret, every whisper a potential weapon. This wasn't a time for heroes in shining armor. This was a time for quiet men working in the everyday, where the most dangerous secrets often hid in plain sight. In the heart of New York City, a city that never sleeps, a city that pulsed with both capitalist dreams and Cold War paranoia, a single cab idles at a curb. Its driver, an unassuming man named John Miller, stares out at the rain-slicked streets. He's just finished another long shift, the smell of stale cigarettes and exhaust clinging to his uniform. He's tired. He's broke. He's just trying to get by, like millions of other Americans. But tonight, he's about to pick up a fare that will rewrite history. A fare that, without him, would have unleashed a disaster so profound, so absolute, that the Cuban Missile Crisis would look like a schoolyard spat. No one knew it then. Not the FBI, not the CIA, not even the president himself. But in the backseat of John Miller's yellow cab, a global catastrophe was just a few miles, and a few hours, away from being set in motion. This wasn't a Hollywood movie. This was real. And the hero wasn't a super spy. He was just a guy. A taxi driver. But before we start, subscribe and leave your like. And comment where you're watching from. It keeps us motivated to bring more such content for you. Now let's go back to Taxi Driver. John Miller wasn't a man who sought adventure. Life had, in fact, been quite the opposite. He was a creature of routine, a man defined by the worn leather of his driver's seat and the endless hum of the city's traffic. Born in the grinding poverty of the Great Depression, he learned early on that survival was a daily grind. He'd seen the world change, from horse-drawn carts to jet planes, from the Dust Bowls to the gleaming skyscrapers of Manhattan. He'd even seen combat. A fleeting, brutal stint in the Pacific during World War II, a time he rarely spoke about, save for the occasional haunted look in his eyes when a siren wailed too close. The war had taught him to pay attention, to notice the small things, the things that could mean the difference between life and death. But that was a long time ago. Now, in the autumn of 1962, he was 48 years old, a widower, living in a small, cramped apartment in Queens, his only companion the ghost of his late wife, Eleanor, and the ceaseless ticking of an old grandfather clock. His life was a mosaic of repetitive motions. Wake up before dawn. Coffee, black and strong. The morning rush hour, a symphony of blaring horns and hurried footsteps. The slow crawl through Midtown, ferrying tourists and business types, their conversations a meaningless drone in his rearview mirror. The long hours, the aching back, the smell of exhaust fumes seeping into his clothes. He was a ghost in the city, an observer, listening to a million fragmented stories, seeing a million faces, none of which ever truly registered. He was invisible, and that was exactly how he liked it. It allowed him to observe, to see. He knew New York like the back of his hand. Not just the main avenues and the iconic landmarks, but the hidden alleys, the shortcuts through congested neighborhoods, the rhythms of its shifting traffic patterns. He knew which diners had the best coffee, which streets were death traps after a heavy rain, and which corners were frequented by the late-night crowd looking for trouble. He saw everything, but he was seen by no one. This was his superpower, though he didn't know it yet. He was a master of observation, honed by years of navigating the urban jungle, his senses always on high alert for the unexpected, the sudden swerve, the jaywalker, the quick change of a traffic light. He had an innate sense of what was normal and what was not. His colleagues, other cabbies at the depot, thought he was a quiet guy, a bit of a loner. They'd share war stories, complain about fares, but John mostly kept to himself, nodding, grunting, sometimes offering a dry, witty comment that would catch them off guard. They saw a man who just wanted to punch his clock and go home. They didn't see the depth beneath the quiet exterior, the mind that processed every detail, categorized every interaction. He was a human database of New York City's underbelly, its heartbeat, its secrets. One cold, wet Tuesday evening, just as the evening news was filling homes across America with grim reports from Cuba, John was pulling out of a greasy spoon diner in the Lower East Side. His shift was nearly over. He had a few more hours, but the rain was coming down hard, and fares were starting to thin out. He was planning to head back to the depot, maybe catch an early night. He rubbed his tired eyes, the faint scent of old fried onions still clinging to his nostrils. He flicked on the radio, a crackly news report about President Kennedy's escalating rhetoric against the Soviet Union. Another ordinary night in a world spiraling towards the unimaginable. But then, his dispatcher's voice crackled through the static of the radio. "Miller, you still out there? Got a pickup for ya. East 72nd Street, near the park. High priority." John sighed. High priority usually meant a big spender, or someone in a huge hurry. Either way, it meant more money. He adjusted his rearview mirror, put the car in gear, and headed uptown. He didn't know it then, but this seemingly routine call, on a dreary, rain-soaked night, was about to shatter his mundane existence and thrust him into a game of espionage he never knew existed. The stage was set, not in some smoky backroom in Moscow or a clandestine bunker in Langley, but in the unassuming interior of a yellow cab, driven by a man nobody noticed. And soon, he would notice something that nobody else did. John pulled up to the address on East 72nd Street, a stately brownstone that looked out of place among the more modern apartment buildings. He squinted through the rain-streaked windshield. A man stood under the awning, a silhouette against the dim streetlights. He was tall, well-dressed in a dark, impeccably tailored overcoat, and carried a single, expensive-looking leather briefcase. He wasn't waving frantically like most late-night fares. He just stood there, perfectly still, almost unnaturally patient. John's internal clock, accustomed to the frantic energy of New Yorkers, registered this stillness as the first anomaly. He pulled the cab to the curb. The man didn't hesitate. He opened the rear door, slid in, and closed it with a soft, deliberate click. No slamming. No fumbling. Just a quiet, practiced movement. The rain had plastered his dark hair flat, but not a single drop seemed to have touched his perfectly polished shoes. "Grand Central," the man said, his voice low, almost a whisper, with an accent John couldn't quite place. It wasn't British, not German, not even the thick European accents he often heard from diplomats. It was flatter, more precise, each syllable carefully articulated, as if he were choosing his words from a dictionary. John nodded, glancing in the rearview mirror. The man was in his late 30s or early 40s, with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes that didn't seem to blink often. He wasn't looking at the city lights or out the window. He was looking straight ahead, at the back of John's head, or maybe just through it. There was a tension in his posture, a rigid stillness that spoke of supreme self-control, yet also an underlying current of immense pressure. Most people, even stressed businessmen, relaxed a little once they were in a cab. This man didn't. He seemed to shrink into himself, yet remain utterly alert. The ride was mostly silent. John navigated the familiar streets, the rhythmic swipe of the wipers the only sound for a long time. He tried to make small talk, as was his habit. "Rough night out there, huh?" he offered, glancing in the mirror. The man's eyes met his for a split second. "Indeed," he replied, his voice still low, almost devoid of inflection. No further elaboration. No complaint about the weather. No comment on the traffic. Just a clipped, one-word response. John felt a prickle of unease. New Yorkers, even the most reserved, usually had something to say. What struck John next was the briefcase. It rested on the man's lap, clutched in both hands. Not just held, but clutched. His knuckles were white. It was an expensive, executive-style case, but it looked heavier than it should have been. And the man held it with an intensity that screamed, "Precious cargo." Most businessmen tossed their briefcases onto the seat beside them, or let them rest casually. This man held his like a life wrapped in a storm. And then John noticed a detail. A tiny, almost imperceptible detail that, to his trained eye, felt like a thunderclap. The man's hands. While they gripped the briefcase tightly, John noticed his thumb. It was constantly, almost imperceptibly, stroking the side of the briefcase. Not nervously, but with a deliberate, almost ritualistic motion. It wasn't a fidget. It was a reassurance. Like a soldier checking his weapon. And then, he saw the fingernails. Immaculately clean, perfectly trimmed, but with a slight discoloration under the nail of his right index finger. A faint, reddish-brown stain. It looked like ink. But not fountain pen ink. Something thicker. Drier. And it was exactly the color of the faint residue John had occasionally seen on the hands of printers he sometimes drove, or people who worked with very specific types of dyes. John filed it away. His mind, honed by years of silent observation, automatically catalogued it, ink. On the hands of a man who clutches a briefcase like it contains the crown jewels, speaks with a strange precision, and exudes a silent tension. Most people wouldn't have noticed. Most people wouldn't have cared. But John wasn't most people. He had seen enough oddities in his taxi to recognize when something was truly out of place. This wasn't a nervous tic. This was something deeper. Something connected to the briefcase. Something connected to the man's unnatural calm and underlying tension. The cab pulled up to Grand Central Terminal, the massive, iconic building glowing under the wet night sky. "That'll be $2.75, John said, turning off the meter. The man reached into his inner coat pocket, pulled out a crisp $10 bill, and handed it over. "Keep the change," he said, his eyes still unblinking. He opened the door, stepped out, and vanished into the bustling terminal without a backward glance, swallowed by the crowd. John watched him go, the image of the man's rigid posture, the clutched briefcase, and that faint ink stain etched into his memory. He felt a shiver, despite the warm cab. It wasn't a normal fare. Not by a long shot. He had driven thousands of people in his life, but none had left such a distinct, unsettling imprint. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew, with a gut feeling that had saved him more than once in the war, that something was profoundly wrong. This wasn't just a businessman rushing to catch a train. This was something else. Something dangerous. The moment the mysterious passenger disappeared into Grand Central, a strange silence descended upon John's cab. The hum of the engine, the distant city noises, all seemed amplified. He sat there for a long moment, the $10 bill clutched in his hand, the extra $7.25 feeling heavy, almost tainted. He usually appreciated a good tip, but this one felt different. It was an offering, almost, a way to dismiss him, to erase the encounter from his mind. But it wouldn't be erased. His initial reaction was dismissal. "Come on, John," he told himself. "It's New York. Everybody's got a story. Everybody's got a secret. Maybe he's a nervous gambler. Maybe he's a doctor carrying organ samples. Maybe he's just a weirdo with ink on his fingers." He'd seen it all. Or so he thought. He tried to shake off the feeling, to convince himself it was just fatigue, the late hour, the grim news from Cuba playing tricks on his mind. He was tired. His back ached. He just wanted to go home, pour himself a whiskey, and forget the day. He drove towards the depot, the wipers still battling the persistent rain. But the image of the man wouldn't leave his mind. The precise speech, the cold eyes, the way he clutched that briefcase. And the ink. That damned ink. What kind of ink was that, anyway? It looked like the kind you'd get from handling freshly printed newspapers, or maybe, just maybe, some kind of stamp. A stamp for official documents? Clandestine papers? His mind, against his will, began to piece together fragments of old war movies, spy novels he'd read on lazy afternoons. The Cold War wasn't just some abstract concept on the radio. It was a living, breathing shadow, and suddenly it felt very close to home. He told himself it was ridiculous. A cab driver, getting involved in international intrigue? It was absurd. He was just John Miller, a guy who paid his taxes and tried to keep his old cab running. He had no training, no connections. He was an invisible cog in the city machine. What could he possibly do? Who would even listen to him? A cabbie with a wild story about a nervous passenger and some ink? They'd laugh him out of the station. Or worse, think he was crazy. But the unease persisted, a dull ache behind his ribs. It wasn't just a hunch. It was a deep, primal certainty. The kind of certainty that comes from years of observing human behavior, of seeing the cracks in the facade. This man was not what he seemed. And the stakes, in John's gut, felt terrifyingly high. He pictured the newspapers, the headlines screaming about Cuba, about the constant threat from the Soviet Union. He remembered the faces of the soldiers he'd served with, the fear in their eyes. He remembered Eleanor, her quiet patriotism, her belief in what America stood for. He felt a duty, a quiet, insistent tug that he couldn't ignore. He pulled into the depot, the fluorescent lights harsh against the darkness of the night. Other drivers were already clocking out, tired conversations drifting through the air. John parked his cab, but he didn't immediately turn off the engine. He just sat there, the car idling, the scent of gasoline and old upholstery filling the small space. He looked down at his own hands, calloused and rough from years of gripping the steering wheel. He imagined those other hands, smooth and precise, with that faint, telltale stain. He knew he couldn't just let it go. It wouldn't let him go. He tried to think of anyone he knew, anyone who might take him seriously. He had an old friend from the war, Mike, who had joined the NYPD. A beat cop, nothing fancy, but he was a good man, steady and practical. Would Mike listen? Or would he just pat John on the shoulder and tell him to get some sleep? John finally turned off the engine. The silence was deafening. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes, and lit one, the small flame momentarily illuminating the worry etched on his face. He took a long drag, the smoke burning his lungs. This wasn't about being a hero. This was about a feeling, a nagging suspicion that something truly terrible was about to happen. And he had been witness to the first tiny tremor. He knew he had to do something, anything, even if it sounded insane. He couldn't just drive away from it. Not now. He pulled out his address book, flipped through the worn pages, and found Mike's number. It was late, but this couldn't wait until morning. The phone call, a simple act, would be the first stone dropped into a pond, sending ripples that would eventually touch the highest echelons of power. It was the first terrifying step an ordinary man took into an extraordinary world. The Cold War just got a new player, and he drove a taxi. The question was, would anyone believe him, and would it be enough to stop what was coming? The phone felt heavy in John's hand, a relic of an era before touch screens, before instantaneous communication. He clutched it, the cigarette smoke curling around his head, outlining the weariness etched on his face. He knew Mike's number by heart, a memory from a time when life felt simpler, if not easier. He dialed. The rings were long, each one amplifying his doubt. It was late. Too late for casual chatter. Finally, a gruff, sleep-laced voice answered. "Yeah? Who is this? Mike? It's John. John Miller." A pause. "Miller? Christ, John, you know what time it is? Everything all right? You hurt?" Mike's voice was laced with immediate concern, a reflex from years on the force, trained to expect the worst. No, I'm fine. I just needed to talk to you. Something happened. Something important." Mike sighed, a long, drawn-out sound that spoke of interrupted sleep and impending annoyance. "Important, John? Like what? Your carburetor finally gave out? You find a Dane willing to listen to your war stories? No, Mike. This isn't like that. This is serious. I picked up a fare tonight. A man. And I think he was a spy." Silence. A very long silence. John could almost hear Mike rubbing his eyes, trying to make sense of the absurdity. Then, a low chuckle. "A spy, John? You've been watching too many of those James Bond flicks? Look, if you got a problem with a fare, call the precinct. Don't wake me up for a Hollywood script." "No, Mike, listen to me," John insisted, his voice hardening, conviction replacing his earlier hesitation. "This wasn't just some shifty character. This was different. He was too calm, too precise. And there was this ink on his finger." "Ink? John, people use pens. People work in offices. You're gonna tell me you found a commie spy because he had ink on his finger?" Mike's tone was dismissive, almost mocking, but John could detect a sliver of curiosity, a faint hook he could sink his teeth into. No, not pen ink. This was different. A certain kind of ink. And the way he held his briefcase, Mike, like it was his last breath. And his eyes. Like he was looking right through me, but seeing everything. No normal New Yorker is that detached. Not during this. Not with Cuba on the news every night. John painted the picture, details spilling out, each observation a brush stroke. The tailored coat, the precise diction, the unnatural stillness, the way he just vanished into Grand Central. He didn't embellish. He just reported what he saw, what he felt. Mike listened, the chuckles fading, replaced by a thoughtful grunt. He knew John. He wasn't a fantasist. He was a solid, reliable guy, if a bit quiet. And the detail about the ink, however minor, was specific. "All right, John, all right," Mike said, his voice less dismissive now, more resigned. "Tell you what. I got an early shift anyway. You meet me at O'Malley's Diner on 3rd Avenue, 6 a.m. We'll have some coffee, and you can tell me this whole thing without waking up my wife. But don't expect me to call the Pentagon." John felt a surge of relief. It wasn't a full victory, but it was a foot in the door. "Thanks, Mike. I'll be there." The next morning, the diner buzzed with the early morning rush, steam rising from coffee cups, the clatter of plates, the murmur of tired conversations. John sat across from Mike, who nursed a black coffee, his uniform shirt slightly rumpled, his face a roadmap of sleepless nights. Mike was a big man, built like a brick wall, with a perpetually suspicious gaze. He'd seen the worst of the city, and he'd grown cynical. John recounted the story again, slowly, deliberately, leaving nothing out. He described the passenger's demeanor, his accent, the briefcase, and especially that ink stain. He emphasized the sheer unnaturalness of the man in a city defined by its frantic, sometimes chaotic, energy. He described the exact shade, the texture of the faint residue he'd observed. Mike listened, occasionally grunting, sometimes jotting down a note on a napkin. He drew a quick, surprisingly accurate sketch of the man based on John's description. When John finished, Mike leaned back, his eyes narrowing. Okay, John, I'll give you this. It's specific. Way too specific for a drunk hallucination. And you're not usually one for wild goose chases. But a Soviet spy? In plain sight? They're usually a lot more cloak and dagger than just riding a cab. That's exactly it, Mike, John countered, leaning forward. He was in plain sight, blending in. That's why no one else saw him. He was supposed to be invisible, just another face in the crowd. But I saw him, because I'm invisible too. Mike considered this, a flicker of something in his eyes. He knew John's history, his quiet observational skills. All right. Look, I can't go to my captain with this. They'd laugh me out of the precinct. And frankly, the FBI would probably do the same. They've got bigger fish to fry right now, what with Cuba and all. But, he paused, stirring his coffee, I know a guy, a detective in a less conventional unit. He deals with the weird stuff. Undercover operations, intelligence gathering, the kind of things that don't fit into a tidy police report. He's a bit of a maverick, but he's got good instincts. Name's Detective Harris. I can mention it to him, unofficially, just to see if anything rings a bell. No promises. It was a small ray of hope, but to John, it felt like the sun breaking through the clouds. Thanks, Mike. That's all I ask. John knew the system. He knew how easily a report could get lost, how quickly an inconvenient truth could be dismissed. But Mike, for all his gruff exterior, was a loyal friend, and he had a rare quality in this city. He knew how to listen. And he knew a man who knew how to listen, too. The unseen network was beginning to stir, not in the halls of power, but in the greasy booths of a New York diner. Mike kept his word. A few days later, John received a call. John? Mike. Harris wants to meet you. Tonight. My place. Don't be late. There was a new urgency in Mike's voice, a tremor of intrigue John hadn't heard before. This wasn't just a favor anymore. Detective Harris was a lean, intense man in his late 40s, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to miss nothing. He wasn't in uniform. He wore a rumpled suit, his tie loosened, a cigarette perpetually dangling from his fingers. He listened to John's story without interruption, nursing a glass of scotch, occasionally glancing at the crude drawing Mike had made. When John finished, the room was silent, save for the crackling of the old radio in the corner, broadcasting another dire update from the Cuban crisis. So, a cab driver, a nervous passenger, a briefcase, and ink on a finger, Harris summarized, his voice a low drawl. You know how many of those I hear about every week, John? New York is full of eccentrics and secrets. But this wasn't just eccentric, John countered, his resolve firm. This was surgical, controlled. Like every movement, every word was planned. And the ink detective, it wasn't ballpoint. It was dense, like printing ink. A dark, almost rusty brown. Harris raised an eyebrow. Printing ink, huh? You a printer, John? No, I'm a cab driver. But I've driven printers. Seen their hands. And this was different. Like it was fresh. But dried on. Not smeared. John was trying to articulate a sensory detail, a visceral recognition he felt in his gut. Harris took a long drag from his cigarette, then exhaled slowly. You're right, Miller. Most people wouldn't notice. Or care. But I might have something. He went to a cluttered desk in the corner, rummaged through a stack of papers, and pulled out a slim file. This came across my desk a few weeks ago. Dismissed as a nuisance, probably kids. A small printing shop down by the East River reported a break-in. Nothing valuable taken. No money, no machinery. Just a specific batch of custom-ordered ink. The owner, old man Papadopoulos, said it was unusual. Special pigments. Very specific. John felt a jolt. What kind of ink? Said it was for some art project. Harris scoffed. But Papadopoulos suspected it was for something else. He described the man who ordered it. Mid-40s, precise, quiet, well-dressed. Said he spoke with a funny accent, but couldn't place it. Sound familiar? John's eyes widened. That's him. That's the man. The pieces clicked into place. Not yet a complete picture, but a clear outline. All right, Harris said, a new glint in his eye. This is interesting. A printing shop break-in, just for ink, and a customer who matches your description perfectly. During the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're talking about a time when every piece of paper, every word, every map could be critical. You think this man was printing counterfeit money? Passports? I don't know, John admitted. But he was clutching that briefcase like it held the blueprints to the world. And he was going to Grand Central. Not leaving the city, but into the terminal. As if he was meeting someone. Or dropping something off. Harris nodded, his mind already racing. Grand Central is a major hub. 1,000 ways in, 1,000 ways out. Perfect for a dead drop or a quick exchange. All right, this is going to be a long shot, but it's the best lead we've had in weeks on anything related to the heightened alert. I'll reach out to my contact at the Bureau, Agent Thompson. He's a pain in the ass, all protocol and paperwork, but he's thorough. He deals with foreign intelligence. See if this rings any bells with his phantom file. Phantom file? John asked. Yeah, Harris said, pouring himself another drink. There's been whispers for months about a highly skilled Soviet operative, codenamed the Cartographer. Nobody's ever seen his face. He's a ghost. Master of disguise, always leaves a clean trail, suspected of operating primarily in logistics and strategic intelligence gathering. They think he's responsible for a series of small, almost undetectable, information leaks related to shipping routes and military supply chain movements. They even had a vague memo, mostly dismissed as speculation, about him using some kind of specialized, untraceable chemical ink for microprinting or secure messaging. Something that leaves a faint, unique residue. John felt a chill crawl down his spine. The ink? His tiny, almost dismissed detail. It wasn't just ink on a finger. It was a signature. A cold, hard fact. The missing piece of an almost invisible puzzle. He wasn't just a cab driver with a wild story anymore. He was the only one who had seen the cartographer's face, the only one who had a physical link to the phantom. This seemingly insignificant break-in at a small print shop, combined with John's precise observations, suddenly gained immense weight. It wasn't just a nervous passenger, it was a ghost, made real by a taxi driver's observant eye. The labyrinth of intelligence was vast, full of false turns and dead ends, but John had, by pure chance and innate skill, provided the first real thread to follow. And that thread led straight to the heart of the Cuban Missile Crisis, suggesting that the cartographer's activities were far more insidious and immediate than anyone had previously imagined. The stakes were no longer just theoretical. They were staring them right in the face. The next day, John found himself in the back of an unmarked Ford sedan, with Mike driving and Detective Harris in the passenger seat. They were heading to the small printing shop near the docks, the one owned by Papadopoulos. John felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. His life, so recently defined by the predictable routes of his cab, was now taking an unpredictable, dangerous detour. "Remember, John," Harris said, glancing back at him. "Don't say anything to Papadopoulos about spies or anything like that. Just confirm the ink. We're just investigating a minor theft dot." "Got it," John replied, his voice steadier than he expected. He was a veteran of the Pacific. He knew how to follow orders, how to keep his head down. The print shop was a dusty, cramped space, smelling of paper, oil, and old machinery. Papadopoulos, a small, wiry man with ink-stained hands, real ink, John noted, eyed them suspiciously. Harris showed him his badge, explained they were following up on the theft, and then casually asked about the custom ink. Papadopoulos, clearly still annoyed by the incident, recounted the story with weary resignation. He pointed to a small, empty shelf. They didn't touch anything else. Just the special batch. Dark brown. Ordered by a man who said he needed it for unique maps. Very precise maps, he said. Not for sale, just for show. John leaned in, his eyes scanning the shelves, the floor, the remnants of pigment on the owner's hands. Mr. Papadopoulos, John asked, could you show me the exact spot where that ink was stored? Did any of it spill? Papadopoulos led him to the back, pointing to a faint, dark smudge on the wooden floorboards, almost invisible under a layer of dust. Just a drop or two. Tried to clean it, but it's stubborn stuff. Never seen anything like it. John knelt, his taxi driver's eyes, trained to spot the minutiae of the urban landscape, scrutinizing the stain. He reached out a finger, almost touching it. This is it, he said, his voice quiet but firm. This is the ink. The shade, the way it had dried, the faint metallic sheen visible in the dim light, it was an exact match to the residue he'd seen on his passenger's thumb. He knew it with absolute certainty. The link was undeniable. Harris exchanged a look with Mike. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a grim determination. They now had concrete evidence linking John's passenger, the cartographer, to a specific source of highly unusual, custom-made ink. And that ink was for unique maps. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, unique maps sounded less like art and more like espionage. Back in the car, Harris immediately picked up the radio, requesting a secure line. He was calling Agent Thompson. Thompson? Harris. I've got something. That cartographer file? Dust it off. We have a face. And a very specific type of ink. And a location. Grand Central Terminal, night of the 23rd. I need you to cross-reference every surveillance report, every intel snippet, every piece of noise that might relate to highly specialized printing materials, strategic mapping, or any unusual activity around Grand Central during that time frame. And I need it now. The silence in the car was thick with unspoken implications. John realized he was no longer just a witness. He was part of the investigation. His testimony, his eyes, his almost uncanny ability to notice what others dismissed, had made him an invaluable asset. He was no longer just the invisible man. He was suddenly, terrifyingly, visible to the forces of intelligence and counterintelligence. Agent Thompson, a bureaucrat by nature, was initially reluctant. He'd spent months chasing shadows, dealing with false leads and overzealous informants. But Harris's calm urgency, and the specificity of John's observations, particularly the ink, caught his attention. He had indeed seen a dismissed report, a minor incident about a communication anomaly near a section of Grand Central often frequented by foreign nationals. A whisper of an observation deemed insignificant in the flood of Cold War intelligence. As Thompson started to cross-reference, a chilling picture began to emerge. The specialized ink, the unique maps, the precise, untraceable movements of the cartographer, and the sudden heightened activity at Grand Central, it all began to coalesce. A few days before John's encounter, a small shipment of outdated, highly detailed nautical charts of the Caribbean, supposedly bound for a university library, had been diverted. The FBI had deemed it an administrative error. Now, with John's information, Thompson realized it wasn't an error. It was a setup. The cartographer was using these diverted charts, likely modifying them with the custom ink, for an unknown, but undoubtedly critical, purpose related to the escalating Cuban situation. The implication was staggering. This wasn't just about stealing secrets. This was about altering them, creating them, possibly for a disinformation campaign, or worse, for operational planning directly related to the movement of Soviet assets or targeting during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The cartographer wasn't just an information gatherer, he was an enabler of action. John Miller, the simple taxi driver, had done what the vast, complex machinery of national intelligence had failed to do. He had given them the first real thread to pull. He had made the phantom real. He had, quite literally, put a face to a name, a destination to a ghost, and a tangible clue to an invisible threat. His quiet observations had just turned a localized police investigation into a matter of national, perhaps global, security. The game was on, and John Miller was now, whether he liked it or not, playing a crucial part. The Cold War had indeed found a new player, and he was no longer just driving the cab. He was helping to steer the course of history. The FBI's headquarters in New York City wasn't the bustling, cinematic hive of activity John imagined. It was a warren of cramped offices, fluorescent lights, and the perpetual clatter of typewriters. Agent Thompson, a man whose suit seemed permanently pressed into his skin, greeted John with a gaze that mixed professional respect with thinly veiled suspicion. John was no longer just a source. He was a potential liability, a civilian with critical, yet unverified, information. They brought him into a small, windowless room. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and unspoken tension. Mike and Harris were there, a comforting presence amidst the unfamiliar faces of grim-faced agents. "Mr. Miller," Thompson began, his voice devoid of warmth, "we need you to tell us everything. Again. But this time, every detail matters. Every single thing you observed about this man, his mannerisms, his clothes, his briefcase, his speech. Imagine you're writing a report for the president. Because, frankly, at this moment, your observations might be the closest thing we have to understanding what this cartographer is planning." The pressure was immense. John felt the weight of the entire Cold War pressing down on his shoulders. He was used to remembering addresses, traffic patterns, the shortest route. Now, he was being asked to delve into the subtle nuances of human behavior under extreme duress. He closed his eyes, forcing himself back into that yellow cab, the rain-slicked streets of Manhattan outside, the silent, deadly presence in his rearview mirror. He started from the beginning, but this time he went deeper. "His eyes," John began, "they weren't just cold. They were watchful. Like a predator, but also like he was always scanning, assessing. He didn't blink much. Almost like he was afraid to miss something." He described the way the man held the briefcase. Not just firm, but almost a possessive grip. Like it was part of him. And when he got out, he didn't adjust his coat, he didn't look back. Just disappeared. He was like smoke. He described the subtle tremor in the man's left hand when he pulled out the money, quickly hidden, but not missed by John's observant eye. He was calm on the surface, but underneath, there was a current. Like a river running fast, just below the ice. He described the faint, almost imperceptible scent of iodine he thought he detected, mixed with a dry, papery smell. And then he went back to the ink. The stain, Agent Thompson. It wasn't just on the tip of his finger. It was slightly under the nail, and there was a fainter, almost ghost-like smudge on the palm of his hand, near the base of his thumb. Like he'd pressed something against it, repeatedly. Thompson scribbled furiously. "Iodine. Papery smell. Smudge on the palm. Gentlemen," he said, looking at his team, "he's describing contact with a freshly printed, high-grade document. Possibly maps, given the ink. And the iodine? That could be a chemical fixative. Some kind of quick-drying agent for sensitive materials. John's recollections were fed into a rapidly growing profile of the cartographer. They cross-referenced his observations with everything they knew, or thought they knew, about the elusive Soviet agent. They even had him walk through a replica of his cab, asking him to point out exactly where the man sat, where the briefcase rested, where his thumb rubbed the leather. They were trying to reconstruct the moment to find any missed clues. The gravity of the situation was hammered home by the constant news bulletins filtering in. The Cuban Missile Crisis was escalating daily. Blockade. Quarantine. Brink of war. Every official in the room moved with a sense of urgent, desperate purpose. Thompson revealed more of what they suspected. Our intelligence suggests the cartographer isn't just a courier. He's a planner, a tactical operative. He translates raw intel into actionable plans. If he's creating these unique maps with specific nautical details, it means he's preparing for a movement. A very specific, very dangerous movement. They showed John photographs, dozens of them, mugshots, grainy surveillance images of known or suspected Soviet operatives. Do you see him here, Mr. Miller? Any of these men? John painstakingly went through each one, his eyes scanning, his memory a finely tuned instrument. No, he said each time, none of these. The man I saw, he had a certain bearing, a contained power. None of these men fit. Then came the impossible task. Thompson turned to John, his gaze unwavering. Mr. Miller, we believe the cartographer is preparing to deliver his completed operational plans. He needs to get them into the hands of a high-level contact, likely before a critical window closes. We think he'll use another major transportation hub. And we think he might use a familiar method. Another cab ride. We need you to go back out there. Drive your cab. Act naturally. Be ready to spot him again. We can't risk sending an agent who might blow his cover. You are the only one who has seen his face, and who he didn't suspect. You are our best chance. John felt his breath catch in his throat. Go back? Drive his cab, knowing he was a target, a potential pawn in a deadly game? He was a cab driver, not a spy. He had a family to think about, or rather, the ghost of one. But he also had a duty, a quiet, insistent voice that reminded him of the sacrifices made in the war, of the threat looming over the world. He remembered the tension in his passenger's eyes, the cold precision. This wasn't just about catching a criminal, it was about preventing a war. He looked at Mike, who gave him a steady, reassuring nod. All right, John said, his voice a little rough, but firm. I'll do it. But I want to know everything. Every contingency. Every signal. I want to be able to protect myself, and to make sure this son of a gun doesn't get away. John Miller, the invisible man, had just agreed to step into the most visible and dangerous role of his life. He was now an active participant, a pawn elevated to a knight in a game that could decide the fate of nations. The stakes, already unimaginably high, had just gotten personal. The next few days blurred into an intense, nerve-wracking existence for John. He was debriefed endlessly, not just on the spy's appearance, but on the precise routines of a New York City cab driver. The FBI wanted to ensure his cover was absolutely watertight. They wired his cab with a tiny, cutting-edge microphone, barely visible behind the dashboard. They provided him with a discreet signal button, a small device he could press in his pocket if he saw anything or anyone. They even gave him a basic self-defense course, a quick, brutal lesson in how to disable an attacker, though John hoped he'd never have to use it. His days were a grim charade. He drove his usual routes, picked up his usual fares, but his senses were acutely honed, constantly scanning, constantly searching for that precise posture, that specific gaze, that faint, telltale stain. Every glance in his rearview mirror was fraught with tension. Every passenger was a potential threat, or, more importantly, not the threat. The city, usually a symphony of predictable chaos, now felt like a giant, silent stage, waiting for a single, deadly actor to reappear. Mike and Harris were never far. They drove unmarked cars, shadowing John's routes, communicating through discreet two-way radios. Agent Thompson ran the entire operation from a mobile command post, a cramped van packed with radio equipment and maps, tracking John's every move. The tension in the country was palpable. News reports spoke of military maneuvers, of diplomatic ultimatums. Every American knew they were closer to war than ever before. John felt it most acutely, driving through the city that might soon be a target. Based on John's observations and further analysis of the printing shop lead, the FBI honed in on a new theory. The cartographer wasn't just delivering documents, he was delivering a method of delivery. The unique maps might not just be plans for sub-movements, but instructions for how to circumvent the U.S. blockade. Hidden within seemingly innocuous items, Grand Central had been a drop-off, a transfer point. His next target would likely be a port, or an area with heavy maritime traffic, to get his plans off the island of Manhattan and onto a vessel. They set up surveillance around the major shipping docks and ferry terminals. John's primary assignment was to patrol areas leading to these locations, specifically during the hours around midnight, when major Cold War intelligence transfers often occurred, exploiting the cover of darkness. Then, on the fourth night, after hours of cruising, of false alarms and dead ends, it happened. John was idling near a less frequented ferry terminal, the kind used for smaller, private charters rather than large commercial ships. The rain had just started again, a light drizzle, making the streetlights shimmer. He looked in his rearview mirror, and there he was, standing under the archway of an old brick building, shielded from the rain, was the man. The same impeccably tailored overcoat, the same rigid posture, the same expensive leather briefcase clutched in his hand. He wasn't hailing a cab. He was waiting. Waiting for his cab. John felt a jolt of adrenaline, cold and sharp, shoot through him. His heart hammered against his ribs. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. He swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe, to act normal. He slowly, deliberately, pulled his cab towards the curb. The man didn't move until John was directly in front of him. Then, with the same practiced ease, he opened the back door and slid in. The quiet click of the door closing echoed in John's ears. "Ferry Terminal, Pier 17," the man said, his voice flat, precise, the same accent. John glanced in the rearview mirror. The cold eyes met his for a fraction of a second. This time, there was a flicker of something in those eyes. Not fear, but a heightened awareness, a subtle tension that even John hadn't seen before. The man was on edge. John nodded, put the car in gear, and smoothly pulled away from the curb. His mind was racing. Pier 17. That was a private charter dock. Small boats. Covert transfers. He subtly, almost imperceptibly, pressed the signal button in his pocket. One long press. This was it. "Rough night out there," John tried, his voice sounding thin even to his own ears. He kept his gaze on the road, watching for the subtle cues from his shadow cars. "Indeed," the spy replied, a hint of something unreadable in his tone. "The weather reflects the mood of the world, wouldn't you agree?" John's heart pounded. This was more than a clipped answer. This was a probe. A test. "Some days," John responded, trying to keep his voice steady, "some days it's hard to tell the difference between the weather and the mood." He could feel the man's eyes on the back of his head. He knew he was being watched, assessed. He gripped the wheel tighter. He passed a street corner, and in his peripheral vision, saw a flash of blue and red. Mike and Harris were closing in, lights off, blending into the night. The cab pulled up to Pier 17. Only a few lights glowed, illuminating the silhouettes of small boats bobbing in the water. No large vessels. A perfect place for a discreet rendezvous. "That'll be $3, John said, trying to keep his voice neutral. The man reached into his coat pocket. John watched him in the mirror, his breath held. He pulled out a crisp bill. But this time, as he handed it over, his eyes were locked on John's. And then John saw it. The flicker of movement in his hand. The briefcase was gone. He'd slipped it to the side, perhaps under his coat, a fraction of a second before John pulled to a stop. "Keep the change," the spy said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He opened the door, but before he could step out, the surrounding area exploded into activity. 2 unmarked sedans screeched to a halt, boxing in the cab. Doors flew open. Agents swarmed out, weapons drawn. "FBI! Don't move!" Thompson's voice boomed through a megaphone. The man froze, half in, half out of the cab. His eyes, for the first time, showed a flash of something akin to surprise, quickly masked by fury. He looked at John, a venomous, piercing glare that cut through the night. "You," he whispered, a sound of pure hatred. "The Invisible Man." Before he could react further, agents swarmed him, pulling him from the cab, pinning him to the rain-slick pavement. They found the briefcase, not under his coat, but clipped underneath the seat of John's cab, a magnetic clasp used for a rapid, silent transfer. He hadn't seen it happen. The spy was that good, that precise. But John had been better. He had seen the subtle shift in weight, the telltale motion, even if he hadn't fully understood it at the time. The cartographer had been caught, not by a brilliant spy, but by a taxi driver who paid attention. John Miller watched as the world's most elusive Soviet agent was cuffed, his dangerous mission thwarted, all from the front seat of his yellow cab. The arrest of the cartographer was swift and decisive. The agents moved with practiced efficiency, securing the suspect and, more importantly, the briefcase. Thompson immediately took possession of the unassuming leather case, his face etched with a mix of relief and grim determination. John, still shaken, watched as the spy was bundled into a waiting car, his eyes, still filled with cold fury, fixed on John until he was out of sight. Back at headquarters, the briefcase was opened under strict security protocols. The contents were chilling. Inside were not just unique maps, but a set of highly detailed, specially prepared nautical charts of the Caribbean Sea, specifically the waters around Cuba. These weren't just standard maps. They were heavily annotated with the distinctive, custom-made ink John had first noticed. The annotations detailed highly precise, pre-planned routes for a squadron of Soviet submarines, nuclear-armed submarines. More critically, the charts indicated specific rendezvous points and coded signals for a series of ostensibly civilian transport ships, disguised with false registries, meant to run the American blockade of Cuba. These ships were not carrying defensive missiles. They were carrying additional offensive warheads and, far more devastatingly, critical components for establishing forward operating launch sites that would significantly reduce the warning time for a Soviet nuclear strike on the U.S. mainland. The cartographer was not merely delivering intelligence. He was delivering the final operational plan for a dramatic escalation of the Cuban Missile Crisis, designed to circumvent the naval blockade and establish a direct, immediate nuclear threat right off America's coast. If these plans had reached their destination, if these submarines and disguised ships had followed these routes, the U.S. response would have been instantaneous and devastating. The delicate diplomatic dance that eventually led to a peaceful resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis would have been impossible. The world would have, almost certainly, plunged into nuclear war. John Miller's small observation, the ink, the briefcase, the man's precise demeanor, had provided the critical, actionable intelligence at a moment when the world hung by a thread. The FBI, using John's eyewitness account, had been able to track down and neutralize a key player in the Soviet strategy, seizing the very plans that could have triggered Armageddon. The news of the cartographer's capture and the specifics of his mission were relayed directly to President Kennedy and his advisors, influencing their negotiating position and hardening their resolve against Khrushchev's brinkmanship. The plans confirmed the Soviet intent to deploy offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba, giving the U.S. irrefutable proof and leverage in the tense standoff. This critical intelligence allowed for more precise diplomatic pressure and military preparedness, ultimately leading to the Soviets agreeing to withdraw their missiles in exchange for U.S. concessions. For John Miller, there were no medals, no ticker-tape parades. His role was classified, his heroism kept a secret to protect him, and the ongoing intelligence efforts. Agent Thompson, however, personally thanked him, his once cold demeanor softened by genuine gratitude. "Mr. Miller," Thompson said, shaking his hand firmly, "you are an American hero. You saw what no one else could, and you acted. You saved us. You saved a lot more than just us." John went back to his life, back to his cab. But he was no longer the invisible man. He saw the city differently, with a deeper appreciation for its hidden currents, its quiet heroes. He understood that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on battlefields, but in the quiet corners of everyday life, by ordinary people who simply choose to pay attention. He still drove his routes, still listened to the endless stories of his passengers, but now he carried a secret knowledge, a quiet pride. He had stared down the face of war and, with nothing but his sharp eyes and a gut feeling, had helped pull the world back from the brink. He never forgot the cold fury in the cartographer's eyes, nor the immense satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference. He was just a taxi driver, but he had been more important than any general or diplomat that night. He had proved that in a world full of noise, sometimes the quietest observers are the most powerful. He was a testament to the idea that vigilance isn't just for spies, but for everyone, and that history is often shaped by the small, unseen actions of everyday people. His story is a reminder. The biggest threats aren't always loud. Sometimes they're a whisper, a subtle stain, a precisely clutched briefcase. And sometimes, the heroes who stop them are the ones you'd never suspect.